Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're joining from. We have Ben here with us who's joining really early, so early morning for him.
Mhm.
Um, it's good to see some familiar faces as well as some faces new. Um, could you please use the chat box to introduce yourself? That just makes us familiar with who we're speaking with. So you can see the chat function right there at the bottom on Zoom. I'm Munib Zulfikar on behalf of the DCD Secretariat. We'll just give it a few more minutes as people trickle in, but please use the chat box to continue introducing yourself. Alrighty, let's get this things going. So welcome again, everyone, to the DCED Results Measurement Series. This is the first of our sessions for 2025. We had an overwhelming response last year. This year we've started a little late, but we plan to become more consistent with some of these sessions moving forward. So keep your eye out for announcements that come through the DCED newsletters, as well as on LinkedIn and through the SwapCard app. Just generally about this webinar, the chat box is an open space, so use that to react to the session or any question or anything that you would want to suggest during the session. Whereas if you have any particular questions, there's a Q&A box as well on Zoom, so that helps us to think through the questions that we would want to address. So for specific questions, do use the Q&A function. The webinar will be recorded, and a recording of the session will be shared with everyone through an email and also uploaded on the SwapCard platform. So you would get a link to that. Our previous webinars are also uploaded there, so you'll get a chance to see things even if you missed out on something. Um, with all this clear, we can go right in. We have a lot to cover, so I will just hand it over to Ben to kick things off.
Great. Thank you very much. And it's really nice to be with everybody here today. Um, yeah, looking forward to our time together here. So I think I'm going to try to maximize the hour and a half by just jumping right in. I think Munib's given us all the info on how to share your thoughts, questions, comments, and also introduce yourself. So yeah, really looking forward to engaging with you all today. So, title of what we wanted to talk about is systemic change, simple tools, tactics, and real talk. So, getting into kind of the specifics of a topic that can be very esoteric, filled with lots of kind of big concepts and difficult to understand terms and phrases. Um, this is me. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Market Share Associates. Um, I've been working for about 22 years in the economic growth space in both designing, optimizing, and measuring the impact of these types of programs. And I've been engaging in the topic of systemic change since about 2013, particularly on the kind of writing and publishing side. And I'm based in Denver, Colorado. Just a little quick intro to Market Share Associates for those who aren't familiar. We engage in three broad areas. One is around private sector engagement, market systems development. Another one is around women's economic empowerment, gender equality, and social inclusion. And finally, everything to do with action learning and adaptation, including, in this case, around how we understand the systems in which we're seeking to change and engage. So there's a lot of background. This is a huge field, and there's a lot out of it. I'm going to point to just a couple of the things that have been influential and that I'm perhaps going to draw more from today. It's far from exclusive, and I've kind of put things that I've had some direct engagement with. But there is a lot out there, a lot of great stuff, and a lot of stuff I've been influenced by that I'm not, going to put on these next slides. But wanted to give a little bit of uh, a flavor to this. And as I do so, I also want to note that we're going to have resources that'll be shared. We've got some QR codes at the end of the slide with some of these, and we've got lots of other things that we can circulate as well. So you can access all of these things. Um, Maybe even before the this piece that I've put up. I was engaged in 2013, supporting DCED on kind of thinking about how systems change could go beyond kind of copying and crowding in to a kind of a broader understanding of what that might mean. Um, uh, Another early piece I was involved in then was looking around at what are the different frameworks that are out there? What can we find as kind of commonalities around those frameworks? And where are there perhaps things that we want to reflect on, think about? That was this piece here on kind of evaluating different kind of frameworks for systemic change. Out of that came a number of practical case studies that were done to really understand what is the kind of state of play as it relates to it, looking at a number of different countries. Those two pieces informed a framework that I contributed to developing for measuring systems change called Disrupting System Dynamics. We'll get into that a little bit later. Um, More recently, we've had a kind of a long-standing effort to help build the capacity within the field for enhancing the measurement of systems change. And particularly not only as an evaluation tool, something you do at the end of a program or even thereafter, but something you're doing as you're implementing. How do you actually practically make this go from something that sounds really theoretical or difficult to do into something that's concrete and hands-on? And so that's where this practitioner's guidance came out from a series of practitioners who were all hands-on people working directly in the field on different programs and figuring out, what's been working. And what I like about this guide is it doesn't just give you, here's the one approach to do it. It kind of says in several places, here's a couple of options, and here's the pros and cons of each of them. So you can kind of reflect on those and use that. Another piece that we put out more recently was called Shifting the Locus of Learning, really about the role that learning can play in creating systems change. So for those of us that are into MEL and see that as our passion, it kind of draws the direct line between our learning work and actually the way it can influence systems. And a final piece I'll point to is just that we have been facilitating this global network of different organizations and practitioners that have been engaged in work around private sector engagement and market systems development. And so have designed and carried out a kind of a skill sprint, it's been called, as in terms of a kind of way of building on some of the core fundamental skills needed around systems change measurement. So here's a few things, influences. It's going to be, you'll see reflected in some of the things we talk about today. Lots more out there, though, as I mentioned. Just a couple things that we are going to focus on. We're going to kind of start with the beginning. We want to make sure that we're starting at the point that we're going to be accessible to everybody. We're going to take a particular dive around frameworks, and we're aiming to be quite interactive. We're going to have several points where we stop, have pauses, let us kind of engage. I certainly don't like hearing myself talk for 90 minutes. I'm sure you won't either. So let's keep this kind of engaging with everybody. What it's not, there's only so much we can cover, and we could have made this a 1 day or a 1 week long kind of exploration of the topic. So we're not trying to be comprehensive today. We're not going to get into kind of indicators and measurement tools. Unfortunately, we had that content, and then we had to, unfortunately, Munib's a very strict and very effective webinar facilitator and kept telling me I'd been putting too much in here. So we also won't get into the topic of contribution. What's our contribution to the systemic changes that we're spotting? That'll maybe be a future topic or something else. So that's kind of what we're aiming for. So the rough ordering that we're going to go through is kind of exploring the basic question of what is systemic change. We'll then go on to the frameworks that we can use to measure it, why, and then what are some. And then we'll dive into a few of the basics on kind of ways to practically do it. Because I think one thing that I hope everyone takes away from this is that systemic change really is something that that programs can do, whether your budget is large or small, and it's relevant. It's not something you have to wait many, many years to think about. Put it just at the end of your program. It's something that you can do kind of from early on. Great. So, what I hope are kind of the three takeaways. I think there's an adage that you may not take away more than three things from anything you attend. So, if that's true, I wanted to be really blunt and give you the three things that I hope you take away. Maybe for many of you, view this as old hat, but if not, these are the things I think are pretty fundamental to the message today. The first is that if we measure systemic change, we can accomplish a range of different objectives. Um, Secondly, that we want to get away from the concept of systemic change as a binary. Was there systemic change? And instead think of it as a more of a continuum. And then finally, that frameworks, far from being kind of annoying academic or esoteric exercises, can actually be a really key and helpful tool that we can use as we're thinking about systemic changes. So that's it. If you can leave now if you want. That's what we're doing. If you want to stay around, we'll go in more depth. So here we are. Yeah, so that's kind of what I wanted to kind of kick off with, a little intro. From here, I think we'll just dive into the basics on kind of why do we care about systemic change? Um, Obviously, I assume do by the fact that you're here. But we want to, just reflect on that a little bit. So we have a poll, and it's going to get popped up into the chat. I think the idea here is let's know the group that's joining today, so we've got some sense of who we're with. So if you don't mind answering that poll, that'd be helpful.
The poll should be on your screen now. It's just three questions. We'll give it a minute.
Right. So pretty kind of introductory questions. First, does your project measure systemic change? If not, are you planning to measure it? And then roughly kind of how well do you feel like you understand this topic walking into it? 5 would be high and 1 would be low.
Few more seconds and then I'll just
So it looks like about 61% answered that their program does measure. 28% said no, but 10% said it's not really relevant to them. So we can up those other two percentages within that project context a little bit higher. So that's good. That's good to see. It's maybe about let's say a 2/3, 1/3 split currently. For those who aren't measuring, many more said they are planning to than that they're not. So it does seem like that is on the radar for pretty much everyone here, with the exception of about 7 respondents. And we've got a lot of 3s and 4s here out of 5. So that's good. So pretty knowledgeable group. And a little bit of spread though. We've got everything from 1 to 5. So I think that's good. That means we can kind of cover it, and I hope you'll find that we kind of are able to hit that mark. Also, I'm glad that the poll worked. I've seen a lot of polls that take like 5 minutes of tortured technology troubleshooting. So, yay, we did it. Um, so, why measure systemic change? I think there's a lot of ways and rationales for doing it. This is a framework from one of the papers I put up before. It's the transformational learning framework. And essentially, systemic change can help us address each of the core 3 functions of learning. It can help us prove our impact. So the kind of accountability function, are we actually making good use of the resources that we have. Um, it can very critically help us to improve our work, though, as well. So by understanding how we're doing, whether the systems we're seeking to transform are actually changing, especially if we're doing that earlier within our programs, we can use that information to actually reflect on and enhance what we're doing. Second, really important thing. And finally, we can also use the exploration of systemic change and how it's doing it, particularly if we do it in a way that engages with core stakeholders in a way that actually helps to transform those systems themselves. And so our systemic change kind of measurement approach can do all those things. It can be done, therefore, at many different stages within a program lifecycle. It doesn't have to be really large and elaborate and rigorous. It can be done in a smaller and more light touch way as well. So there's many ways to kind of approach systemic change measurement, and ultimately it can help us with each of these three aims. So with that as some of the core kind of ways and approaches about why we do this, let's ask ourselves the question of what is systemic change anyway? And I find it's helpful to start here because when we start with really different impressions of what we're talking about with this phrase, we do have a risk that we kind of go in a lot. The assumptions underlying what we're discussing then are very different, and hence it can lead sometimes to some miscommunication or confusion and so on and so forth. So I find it's helpful for us to start here. So there are, you would think, especially because many of us are working in contexts where we're working on programs that are taking a systems approach in one way or another, or we're funding those types of programs. Maybe this should be straightforward, right? In my own experience, I haven't always found that to be true, though. I've found that actually it can be a bit of a challenging thing, right? Well, my argument is that definitions aren't necessarily that helpful themselves. So we can give lots of definitions of what systemic change is. I've thrown 4 of them up. There's many more. Maybe some of the other ones are a lot better. Who knows? But here's 4 starting points. The reality is you read them and I don't know, do you walk away feeling like you now fully understand what systemic change is? There's a lot of like good meat within these things. They sometimes identify what types of things are the focus, how you might know that a change is systemic. Kind of those elements are being touched on, but I personally have found it sometimes more helpful to dive into like practicalities. What does this look like in practice? Because any definition, of course, has to be broad. It has to cover a whole range of different scenarios, and in its essence, therefore, doesn't always let us think about it carefully within our own context. So, my vote is let's look a bit more specifically at what this can mean. So question for the group, how comfortable do you feel explaining what a systemic change is? Feel free to drop something in the chat. If you were talking to a colleague, maybe someone who's newly joined your team, would you would you feel like you were able to give them a pretty clear explanation of what we're talking about here today? So the way I like to start when I'm thinking about systemic changes is what ultimately are we trying to change anyway? What is the basis for us being here? Why are we kind of focused on this topic? Well, ultimately, for those of us within either as funders or as implementers, we have a mandate to create social change. And we want to make that happen. And systemic change is ultimately a tool to make that happen at larger scale and more sustainably than it might otherwise happen. I think for many of us, most of us, I hope, that's kind of the entry point for why we even care about this topic. It's because we believe that systems change ultimately is going to create that deeper, more longer lasting and larger scale change than we might otherwise see. So we can call that kind of our desired vision for systems change. And that's something we want to kind of dive into and understand. Um, so, you know, I think most of us, I think, maybe not, are familiar with setting such visions. That's something that we often do early on in our kind of programming approach or in the design of a funding framework, is that we start to think about, well, ultimately, what will tell us that we've succeeded, right? Um, we can draw on a lot of different inputs to do that, right? Whether it's kind of funder set priorities, the results of the analyses we've done, our ongoing learning about what's working and what isn't, where we're seeing that the kind of barriers are to the change we want to see. All those things might be in there, right? And this ultimately links back within the kind of original M4P framework to kind of a vision for how systems change ultimately is at the core for creating that kind of broader change we want to see, right? So it's there fundamentally at the root. If we don't see systems change, are we likely to see that sustainable and large scale poverty reduction that we want to aim for? Perhaps not, you know? So that's ultimately why we care about this. So as we're thinking about what is systems change, we really want to link it back to what is our vision. And that becomes really important. Um, so if you're so inclined, feel free to share your own desired vision for systems change in the chat. You could reflect on the question, if our focus system was going to look in the way we want it to look, what would that look like? Because I think that's something, ultimately that's the so what question that we're all thinking about here is like, so what? Why do we care about systems change? It's not just great as a concept in itself. We're doing it for a particular purpose. We'll give everyone maybe 30 seconds to reflect on that and pop it in. Think about what does that look like for you? All
Getting
right.
it
Well,
from the chat,
mhm.
yeah.
Sorry, say again, Munib.
There's some good insights in the chat. Um,
Mhm.
so I mean, someone has actually said sometimes it's easier to define what is not systems change, be a more
Mm.
useful exercise. People talk about changes in cultural values and behaviors in the community, effective input supply system. So it's,
Mhm.
context specific there.
Oops. Ah,
Yeah.
sorry. Hmm.
More of a transformation, shift in behavior pattern of firms and various market actors.
Hmm.
Somebody has said like maybe it's easier for people who have worked with programs that work with system actors as compared to others.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, these are fantastic, actually. I really like the number of different ways this being approached, but all kind of thinking about these broader transformational shifts. I love it. Sweet. I'm going to skip actually by my next slide, I think, because I will just give me 1 second. Okay, that's it. I actually wanted to do this in a different order, but whatever. We're going to do it in this order. All right. So we're going to talk about a particular case that's going to allow us to get into some specifics today about a particular context and a particular program that was looking at it. And then we're going to use that for an exercise that we're going to work on together. So this was from a ex post study done about 3 years after the end of implementation. Um, as I said, systemic change can be measured at many different stages, right? And probably in most cases, it's being measured alongside the implementation. of a program. So my choice of an ex post study as an example isn't for suggesting that that's the ideal time to do it. Um, However, I think it is an interesting case to use because it also allows you to see how systems have continued to change after the end of ongoing programming, which is rare, I think. Many of us find that it's too infrequent that there's funding to look post, program closure at how systems that we're hoping have continued to kind of grow in scale and sustainability, if that's actually happened or not. And this was one of those great cases where a funder was willing to put up the resources to actually test whether this happened or not. So this was a program in Senegal. It operated from 2015 to 2019. And I should clarify that was for phase two. So this was a second phase of a program that originally started in 2009. So it had operated in two phases for about 10 years. And the study itself was done 3.5 years following the end of the second phase. And there had not been a follow on round of funding by that donor subsequently. As well, there had, given just the nature of what it was focusing on, there had not been a lot. Of course, there's always some, but there had not been like any other direct follow-on funding happening from some other donor to address the exact same issue in a similar way. So I think that's relevant. So there were roughly 4 different focus functions that were being targeted by the program around the aggregation of crop, access to finance, access to information around commodities, and kind of crop standard setting and enforcement. The particular intervention that we looked at was something called the integrated finance mechanism. This was a big program. It did a lot of things. And I think one of the things when you're looking at systems change is that you often can't look at everything. A system is enormous, right? I mean, it all depends on where you set the boundaries to your system. But you have to be careful or it will become impossible to actually examine and understand where changes happened. So we had to be very careful in setting the boundaries for this study that we were looking at a manageable portion of what that program had done. And we picked the work around the integrated finance mechanism as that point. This is what that IFM was. There's a lot of text here. I don't expect you to read it. It would take too long for us to go through all of it anyway. But in brief, what the IFM did was it made the rice crop that processors would buy and process into collateral that you could borrow against. So as these processors are spending a whole lot of money purchasing the crop at the harvest time, instead of needing to buy, process, sell, and then get more money to go back and purchase more crop, which slowed down the entire process, made it really impede the capital and the ability of this kind of domestic rice sector to work quickly and effectively. It collateralized that rice crop. And so it was a very radical concept when it was first introduced. But it meant that the processors that previously could only borrow against their fixed assets, like the warehouses and the processing equipment itself, suddenly had many multiples more access to capital on the basis of this rice. These were stored in bonded warehouses. So there was also an intervention around getting third-party warehouse managers involved that would make sure that the bank's collateral didn't suddenly disappear. And that also meant through some more formalized contracting between those processors who wanted to make sure they had a guaranteed supply of rice to process, that farmers could also get pre-season access to credit for the inputs they needed to purchase. So it's kind of affecting access to credit for both the rice processors and also for the rice farmers as well. So this was a process that had been going on throughout much of the life of the program, and this is the one that we chose to look at. I want to share with you some of the specific systemic changes that we found through the study. Um, it would take a long time to explain exactly how we designed the study and all of those things. But basically, what I want to do is share some of the findings that came out of it. I think these are interesting because they might be the kind of things that for you, you know, and as we dive into these examples and the frameworks, we can use this just the way that a funder or an implementer that's working on a program is going to have some of these findings come out as a result of your programming. Um, so one of them was that market actors accept signed contracts and secured crop as collateral. Um, that was an enormous shift in the system. That was something that had previously not been um, even thought of as a mental model that rice could or any crop could be a source of collateral. Um, so seeing that this had taken root not only with the couple of processors that started the process, but had become kind of widespread across the sector as being something that you needed to, or that was the way of doing business moving forward, had become quite important. Um, Second, that preseason contracting had become a widespread practice as well. So you don't just wait until harvest time to go out and find rice. Contracting is actually happening in real time. Third is that Senegalese rice starts to effectively compete in higher value markets. So for originally at the start of the program, domestically produced rice was kind of seen as inferior. It was something that you bought if you couldn't afford imported rice. And so it was kind of seen as the lesser, what was primarily serving rural markets. So as a result of the kind of different quality improvements, the better procurement systems, the use of inputs, etc., rice really started to now be seen not only as something that you bought if you couldn't afford anything else, but as something that was just as good and actually worthy of an urban market in Senegal. And also, the National Agricultural Bank expanded the program. So this was the original partner that was working and introducing the IFM. But critically, it went not only from being offered in the north, where it had started out, um, they ended up expanding it to the center and the south of the country, and from only two value chains to seven different ones. So it went far beyond the rice sector by the time that this study was done. Those are a few examples of things that came out of the study, right? So as we're thinking about what is systems change, and that's going to look very different in each one of your programs. This is a small slice of the things that were found, but for the purposes of the time we have today, felt like a nice set of things we could actually dive into and tackle as we're thinking about it. You can also see from the chart, the amount of money lent via the IFM ballooned from, about 13 million at the end of the program up to about 88, 90 million dollars. And so there's quite a substantial expansion in that kind of adoption. And interestingly, this was all stuff that happened after the program closed. So this wasn't with continued, active support of the program to make sure that this expansion happened. It was something that was kind of taking on a life of its own. And we'll go into later a couple of more examples, but I wanted to give you these as a starting point as we're starting to think about this and what this can look like in practice. So, and I think looking at the examples that people shared, I know I can see where those threes and fours and fives are because I think I didn't see some of the kind of common missteps that I sometimes see happening as we're talking about designing our kind of systems change vision and really thinking about what we want to put in as our system vision. And so one of those ones that we typically want to avoid is defining our systems change as the investments that a particular funder or program is making, right? So, for example, there's an investment in a new seed testing facility, something like that. Um, why not? Well, that could be a sign that may eventually become a system change. But at the present, we only know that an input was put into the system. It may have little to no change on the system itself. But I often see that there can be a tendency for us to include those types of things that we ourselves are doing, right? And say those are the system changes. Um, so I think we need to really be careful when we look at that. I think other ones are around the activities and the direct results of those activities. Okay, well, we trained a bunch of farmers, right? Again, maybe they'll never use that training, right? Or maybe they'll never use those seeds. So we need to kind of be really clear and draw that line in the sand for looking at how the system has changed versus observing our inputs into the system or anyone else's inputs into the system, which may or may not be there. Um, Another thing I often observe is that us defining and describing system change in terms of the development impacts we want to see, um, which is ultimately why we are aiming for systems change, right? Higher income, more jobs, that sort of thing. Um, but as we all know, there's many ways that you could achieve those results in very temporary, subsidy-led approaches that ultimately will not survive the end of short-term, external funded programming. And so that's why defining that as your systems change, again, can throw you off because you might be observing a change that's very temporary and is not actually inherent or fundamentally a part of that system itself. Um, Even, and this is getting closer to what we want to see, even when we see a function changing, more access to inputs, we still need to have some clarity about how did that happen, right? Because again, maybe that happened through a large scale temporary subsidy program that we don't have a lot of confidence is going to be maintained. Maybe it will be, and that might be different. But in a case where it's, say, supported and funded with external resources, that could be a red flag. So, what are some other things that you can think of that maybe you've come across and said, I don't know, is that actually systems change? I am skeptical. If any other thoughts come to your mind, pop them into the chat and we can all share our own experiences of what those types of things are. I think it's something that as we explore and use this language, one of the things I always feel can happen in development is a new term. Not that systems change is that new, but new terms can be introduced and then misused very badly, and all of a sudden everyone says, "Well, wait a minute." Everyone says they're doing, system change, but it sounds a lot like what they were always doing. So I think that's one reason that like really being clear on our language and what we're referring to is helpful and is really important, so that we are actually clear on what we're talking about here. So that's some whatnots. And I think you mentioned earlier, someone was even maybe mentioning that it's a good place to start is what isn't it, right? So that kind of aligned with the thought process here as well, is like, let's kind of call out some of the things that we think we don't want to describe using that term. Because if everything is systems change, then what's the point of using the phrase? Then we should just use the words and the language we've always been using. It kind of loses all meaning, right? So that's some knots. Um, let's
Ben,
dive
if I
into.
could, sorry, Ben, if I could just like quickly
Yeah.
uh, push some questions on you which are related to the example you've been sharing.
Okay.
I think one
Sure.
question Sarah had was like, how did you end up deciding on the IFM intervention, particularly from the project? Like, why this while ignoring the others? Or
Yeah. Yeah.
how
Right.
did you get to that point, right? Like focusing on one. And another
Hmm.
one related to this, Jonas says, like, yes, now we see retrospectively, this is all systemic change, but a problem which most projects have is the attribution gap. So how much of this, because it's very evidence focused on how you measure it, right? So how
Yeah.
did you get to the decision on focusing on this one? And how do you address attribution gaps here? Because if it
Yeah.
has been some time, there can be other contributing factors which might have happened there. So maybe those ones I would just want to
Yeah, of
point
course.
out to you now.
Those are
Yeah.
great. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Great for understanding the example. 100% agree. So this was part of a series that was funded to do 5 different ex post studies of programs that had taken a market systems development approach to understand. Many of you may be familiar with the hockey stick, the kind of this idea that program ends, but results will continue getting better and better thereafter. It's the rationale for funding MSD, right? Is like it's not direct delivery, it doesn't collapse the moment your funding collapses, and all these types of things. But there's startlingly little evidence for that when we went out to actually examine. And the Beam evidence review every 2 years has consistently said the same thing. Like, where's the ex post? Where's the ex post? So this was an effort to start addressing that evidence gap, right? And so in designing those studies, then one of the things we very intentionally and made no bones about it, we're not doing a an objective, like random sample selection of all MSD programs and randomly choosing one and doing an ex post on it. Because the last thing we want to do, like that we know, let's say 80%, whatever percentage you want to put on it, of MSD interventions won't work, right? We know that. It's a portfolio approach. Some of them will work and go big, and most of them won't work, right? That's the nature of the approach. So the last thing we want to do, it's not going to be a very interesting study to study something that everyone knew from the outset didn't work. And then we go back 3 years later and it still didn't work, right? We wanted to see, and we were specifically trying to test, okay, when you've seen momentum in a system, when you've seen even by the end of a program that there's really large scale change starting to happen, what happens next? Does that continue? Is the hockey stick, is there some evidence that that hockey stick trajectory can actually occur? Or does it actually, die off, once the program ends and funding ends and all of the rest of it. So we were very explicitly choosing programs that had seen by the end, by program closure, some significant change and wanted to know, and we wanted to know, well, what happened next? So that was very much how we chose IFM. When we went to Natal and Bai, a lot of it was saying, well, where are those bright lights? And within it, IFM stood out as something that we could kind of manageably study and it had some significant suggestion of impact, but people didn't know necessarily what had happened or the extent to which that had changed, right? So that was where we wanted to dive in. And that was the same for the other studies that we did as well. In terms of the attribution gap, I think so. Different answer for like an evaluation versus ongoing monitoring. But in the case of this, which was an ex post, we built that into the selection process. So we very much were trying to find programs where there had been no immediate follow on next phase, that it immediately started working with all the same market actors and advancing the very same interventions that had been advanced in the previous one. We felt it would be very hard in that case then to say we were looking at how that system had evolved outside of the support of that particular program. Now, make no bones about it. These systems are dynamic, not even from external funders, but government. There's a range of players that are involved in them. Nevertheless, I think this particular one is a really interesting case because the main player that was otherwise involved in a significant way addressing something that the types of problems that the IFM was one other entity, the IFC, and it was doing it in a different way, actually, in a warehouse receipt system that was benefiting farmers that could borrow against their crop when deposited at a warehouse, but was building on the same warehouse system that had been set up by Natal and Bai. So we tried basically to address the attribution question first, to not use the word attribution, because with systems change, I don't think you can. I think contribution is the word we preferred to use. But secondly, to really in the design and selection, look at cases where we felt we could have more confidence that it wasn't so insanely rife with other entities that it would be next to impossible to do it. And so that in many of the studies meant we would carve off some areas and say, can't study that one. This part of the program is just there's too many entities involved in it. We're gonna set that one aside. Great. Yeah,
I know
that's
we've
those are
got a
just
lot to cover, but I would just add one more question here for you, Ben.
okay, sure.
I think another interesting element is because when we talk about systemic changes, I think one entry point people usually think about is also policy, which
Mm,
itself can be quite impactful because it's a
yeah.
bigger change and can impact like a whole system. But over there, it becomes really hard to measure contribution when it comes to policy level changes. So I think a question is if
Yeah.
a project does aspire to go towards policy level changes, how should they plan their measurement and contribution around it? Or should they even worry
Mm,
about how much are they contributing towards it as long as they're pushing policy? That's the only
right.
one before you go to the next one. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's probably one of the things. So, sign, unfortunately, we didn't get into. We're not going to get into today. It was on the chopping block of content we didn't have time for. But in terms of contribution, that practitioner's guidance document that I referred to has a nice section on contribution as it relates to systemic change measurement. I would encourage checking that out. It talks about the use of rubrics as one approach that can be helpful. Because I think, and we all know this, right? It's not a binary either. Yes, we did or no, we didn't. It's like we had probably some contribution. And so what we're really interested in is, was it substantial contribution? Was it next to none? Maybe it was none. It's possible it was none. But it could be anywhere on a continuum, right? And we all know also that in some cases people don't want to say anyone else had some contribution to their what they did, right? In the case of Senegal, because it's relevant and policy was there, it actually is on a later slide as another one of the things we found is that the government actually introduced again after the end of the program. So and this is where it's also like, does it matter? I don't know if it actually matters in this case. Like the government really bought into the IFM, liked the results it was having, and so actually introduced a subsidy program to help ensure or encourage more processors to use it. So there was a, 2 CFA subsidy per kilo of rice purchased for anyone that was using the IFM mechanism. So that came in post program. So no contribution attribution. Certainly because the program introduced the IFM, logically they have some strong contribution to that happening, right? But yeah, I think it's one of those things where you can use some tools to try and figure out the level of contribution to some of those policy changes. You'll probably never be able to say it was all us. But I think if you look at some of the different factors that would tell you what contribution you had, that can be through things like KIIs to get perspectives, but also looking at the sequencing and the timing, that became really important. So, for example, with each of these ex posts, we built kind of retrospective hockey sticks of the timing of results and how scale had changed over time. That also really, I think, helps to tell the story too. So you can see, well, where did the takeoff happen relative to the policy change, these types of things. You can start to tie different pieces of your observations about how the system is changing together. Yeah, great. Well, I love talking about Senegal, so we could go on for a long time. It's very fascinating. And just to be able to see kind of the way that change continued post program for me was a particularly exciting experience to have. So we can also talk about not only what isn't, but what is. Now, when we talk about what is, there's no exhaustive list, of course, because there's many things. And I think one of the things we're going to talk about later is actually how different frameworks can help us to actually expand our thinking about what types of systemic changes we might want to look for. So we don't have to kind of limit ourselves to saying this is the like definitive list. We'll never make that list anyway. There's a lot that's contextual based on the system we're looking at, right? And a bunch of the different frameworks that are out there actually suggest different types of systems changes you might want to be looking at, including the two that we're going to look at today, but many others as well. So one of the things actually why I'm an advocate of using frameworks is because they actually help us to think about this. And by looking at different frameworks, not just a single one, we can actually expand our thinking about what are some of those changes we might be looking for. Um, so this slide has a few examples, um, things that we might think about and we might consider to be important measures that a system is changing. Someone just mentioned policy. Well, there's in some way a link there to the distribution of power, right? That can be important in certain settings, in certain systems, and the formal rules. Um, who's engaged in the system could change. That could be a really important thing. A lot of people are using social network analysis and other similar tools that help to map out the way that the the way the system is constituted has actually changed, or the way that the relationships between different actors within the system have changed. So those are really, I think, critical elements that can exist. Um, and there's lots else. We can see mental models, norms changing, resource availability, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you have so many other things you would add to this list, and so feel free to do so in the chat as we're going. Um, so that's where we're at. I'm thinking we probably want to keep going just from a timing perspective. But again, we could talk about all this stuff for a long time. So here's a little mini checklist. I don't think there's hard and fast rules, so don't use it as it has to be like this way or that way, or if it doesn't include one of these things, then it's necessarily a problem. But here's a few things you might want to look at when you're thinking about your systems change vision, um, whether it includes and avoids some of the things that are in here, right? And I think these are the things we kind of talked about, particularly on the slide around the don'ts, but there's also some things as we're thinking about the scale of change, right? Like, are we seeing things? Does our vision have a sufficiently large scale of change that we're anticipating? That's something we should really be asking ourselves. Is our vision sufficiently large? Um, and is it going to be, sustainable, sticky? Is it going to kind of persist? Um, do we have the boundaries clear on where we want change to happen? Our system could be as big or as small as we define it, could be global, it could be a single district, or it could be defined in many other ways. But being clear on what is the boundary of the system, at least to start, those boundaries can change over time. But at least to start with, I've found really helpful as we start thinking about our ambitions for system change. So those are some things to just reflect on as you're kind of working on that. What we want to do next, and I know we have a pause point here, uh, so we could take another thing or two. I know we've got lots more we wanted to cover today. So maybe I'll leave it up to you, Munib, about whether we should move on perhaps, or pause.
I would suggest we can move on because we're taking questions as we go along, so I think it should be okay.
Great. Okay. I'm relieved. All right. Now we're going to get into the framework element, which we really wanted to make sure we had some time for today. And the idea here is, as we're thinking about what we want to cover, there's different approaches, right? Frameworks are particularly helpful at thinking and helping us reflect on what we might see, right? And there's a lot of approaches, DCED with its results chains, for example, encourages kind of mapping out and really thinking ahead to what you might want to see in terms of how your system's going to change, right? I would just make a quick note though. We have to be a little careful at only using that type of a theory-based approach, as it's called, because a lot of systems change in unpredictable ways. they might not always change in positive ways either. I've seen system change frameworks that have defined a system change as only a good thing that happens. And I really don't agree with that. We have to be conscious that systems might change in ways that actually we don't, that aren't helpful for our target populations. And so we do need to, I think, be open to both examining and looking for those theory-based approaches, but also being open to other unexpected changes that may occur, right? Um, so I'm personally a fan of using frameworks, as I think I've mentioned already. Um, and we only have time today to do two. Probably don't even have time for two, but let's do two anyway. That being said, my selection of two is not for, it's not saying, and I hope no one walks away thinking I'm saying, that these are the two or something like that. There's many out there and many great ones, and they all add some great value. So if you have some frameworks for systems change that you particularly like and you think others that are attending today should check out, please drop them in the chat. Because that way we can all kind of learn from each other and we can all walk away with some good understanding of what else is out there. Um, so I'm going to start with one of the two. I decided why not do the classic one, the one that I think most people joining today probably have some strong familiarity with, because I think it's good to actually start there, right? Um, and then also introduce another one that there might be less familiarity around and which approaches the topic in a very different way. So that's kind of the thought process is we look at two and we're going to have a chance. I'm not going to talk for too long so we can actually have a chance to dive in and practice applying this ourselves. Um, but this AAER framework for those who and apologies to those who know this well. Maybe some of the creators are on today. I don't know. Was created in 2014, so about 11 years old. Um, and I think it was created with a lot of engagement with the Catalyst program in Bangladesh. Um, it got kind of tested out and applied and updated with Catalyst. And it is one of the frameworks that I think has seen a lot of traction. It has a very much like it's very catchy, right? The AAER, it's like four boxes. We can kind of understand it very easily. And it's separated into kind of how it works for application by program. So this one is very much one I think that is directed at implementers that are looking at how do we use this in practice, right? We have our piloting phase where we are going to work with particular market actors, help them to adopt a change in their existing practices. Um, we want to see if that happens. We want to see if they plan to keep applying it or not. And then from there, the adaptation, are those same initial partners that we're working with, um, updating, independently investing, all those types of things that would tell us changing it, that there is some buy-in, and there's some signs of sustainability through that happening. And then the AAER also encourages us to look at, well, what happens beyond those initial partners, right? Do others find this relevant? Do they jump in? Um, do they change the model at all? Do they adopt it in exactly the same way? And then what changes in the broader set of functions as we see this, Um, I probably am not going to say too much more because I think I'm explaining to a lot of people who've already probably even used AAR quite a bit. But that's the essence of it. You can see here there's a lot of the the thought process behind it is very much the kind of theory, diffusion of innovations theory. Like you introduce something and then it spreads within a system and you kind of have that uptake happening in that way, right? Very kind of like focused at the intervention level as well. So those are some of the elements and aspects of the AAER. I'm going to share a second framework as well. This is called the Disrupting System Dynamics Framework. This was developed in 2016 with funding from USAID. It's one of the papers that I mentioned at the start. This one came out from a reflection of some of the different frameworks that were out there and some of the kind of systems thinking that was out there and thinking, okay, well, what maybe do we want to reflect on and build into it. Um, so some of the key things to point out with the DSD, as it's called, one is that boundaries are really explicit. So this framework really encourages you to think about where are the boundaries, how do I want to bound the system that I'm looking in? So it's not necessarily starting with one intervention. It's saying, I might want to bound it here or here or here. Um, and I'm not going to I'm going to look at certainly the intervention because typically I'm interested in how an intervention is changing the system, but I also want to be clear on the history and the conditions that have also affected because those history and conditions, it's well understood, affect how a system can change. If we're not aware of and conscious of those initial conditions, then we might not have a very strong understanding or a realistic understanding of how the system is going to evolve. When we talk about things like power dynamics, those can really play into how benefits get distributed in a system. We need to be aware of that, so that we don't inadvertently help to actually reinforce negative power dynamics, for example. Um, then the framework is looking at both signs of changes that are stronger, as well as deeper. Stronger, things like crowding in, other actors getting involved, or increases in some of the signs of change that are happening, but also deeper. So those are more systemic, so you see some of your early signs of change, which are called disruptions, things like investments, new relationships being created, that kind of thing. And then you look though at those kind of deeper or stickier signs of change, the types of changes that are less likely to be quickly reversed, which include things like how networks have evolved and also normative changes. So the mental models that are actually affecting how different people think within the system and can be very hard to change, but when they do, can be very long lasting. And ultimately, then the whole reason this is happening and what needs to be also considered is ultimately what is the desired impact on the target population. So that's a quick run through of that. I could talk, for a lot more time on either of these, but I think if I do that, we're not going to have the time necessarily to dive into an actual example, and I do want to make sure we do. So I might give one or two more quick points, but then I want to dive pretty quickly into the actual opportunity to look at the Senegal case and see, well, how would that be applied? How might we use these frameworks as a way to interpret those examples, right? So this is just a little bit of definitions of some of those things that I mentioned before, but as I said, I don't really want to get into this in too much depth, or we won't have time to do it together. So what I want to do now is actually give us a chance to use one or both of the two cases and or pardon me, the two frameworks, and to use some of the results that came out of the Senegal example and fit them into that one of those frameworks. Where do they fit? How might they help to prompt our thinking about it, right? Now we're doing this kind of ex post, but we could do this ex ante. And in many cases, these frameworks are designed as an ex ante thinking tool to think about what you might expect to see. And I think one of the things we might discover is that each of these frameworks will push our thinking in different directions. And that's kind of the point, is that we want, that could be helpful because that could actually help us to understand it. So I think there's a Google Drive link being put in the chat.
Just drop that.
Munib?
Yeah, I've just dropped it.
Excellent. So basically, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to just show you quickly. I suspect this will probably not be a much of a question here, but I do just want to make sure that, okay, essentially, no, that's not the right one. This is what it looks like. This is the document that you'll get that's fillable with the two frameworks, and you can kind of put in your thinking about it, right? There is on the Google link, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but essentially an opportunity to click on it and just double click. And then I think you need to download it to your computer, don't you, Munib? I think you can't edit it as a live file, or else everyone would be working on the same one.
Yes. Please download it and you can just work on it on your system, and then Ben will share like a more filled version of the template with you afterwards. So let's take 5 minutes just to think through it.
So here's what it looks like. You can just see double click and download button right here, and then you can jump in. And I'm going to share my screen so that you have the examples of the some of the systemic changes that we spotted in Senegal. And I'd encourage you to use these ones to um, to fill the framework out.
I've dropped the link again, and yeah, you've got the examples in front of you, Uni, that you were asking for.
Oh, pasting the questions. Yeah, I mean, good question. It's basically kind of if you take these six changes that we've spotted, where do you think they would fit within those two frameworks? Based on the relatively limited explanation that I provided, but hopefully it's enough to at least give you some room to reflect on it. So it's basically put them in and then reflect where do you think those fit within these two frameworks, Um, what else did I ask? I think there's something about kind of was there anything that yeah, what questions emerged? Did you struggle to figure out, or did it feel challenging to figure out where some of these changes might fit within that particular framework? So yeah, reflecting on those points.
We see quite a few people who have used the AAER framework before, so I would actually encourage them to use the other one just to try it out, because I feel like sometimes you're so familiar with one you haven't used the next one. So,
Mhm.
while everyone's working, Ben, you could have a look at some of the questions that have come in.
Mm,
Okay.
great. Good point. Great. Yeah, well, while people are working on that, maybe just to touch on a couple of quick points. Um, Uni asked, what do you think about measuring changes on behavioral aspects of actors that definitely drive systemic change, but are not necessarily that tangible to measure? I think that's a good question. And so I think as you're reflecting on that, you might want to think about what are the ways I would know if those, if you can't actually measure um, that, think about, well, what would the result be, right? Personally, I've found it's often easier to find or observe the changes in behavior, and it's more the changes in attitudes, norms, beliefs that are sometimes the harder ones, or at least the more costly and involved ones to capture. But I guess it depends on behavior. Yeah, like intra-household behaviors, might be things that are not easily observed. Um, So I think thinking about in those cases, well, how might you do it? And there is fortunately lots of work being done to capture some of those perceptions, beliefs, norms, etc., um, even on pretty large scale. So I think it can be done. Um, I think it's probably just, for each one, what is the um, coming up with the plan based on your kind of system change vision? Because maybe you don't even need to capture that, and you can jump to what you want to see happen after that, and maybe that's the easier or more straightforward way to do it. Yeah.
Ben, there's a question on what IFM and LBA stand for. If you just.
Sorry about LBA and IFM.
Mhm.
Hmm. IFM is the integrated finance mechanism. So this was the mechanism that essentially allowed the collateralization of crop so that it could be borrowed against. Um, and the LBA is the name of the large national agricultural bank. It's La Banque Agricole in French, LBA for short. Yeah.
I think let's give it a couple more minutes before you could.
Yeah. Um, just to, Mike posed, I think, a big question, which is around kind of, was this more incremental than structural economic change? Does it maybe warrant the the description of it, maybe not as a systems change, but as a transformational change? Um, I think there's a couple ways to think about that. Um, and I think it's a lens I love that you're bringing, Mike, because it's something we should always be thinking is like, are we really working on the right problems or not? And I think that sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're working on things where change is going to be at the margins. It's not going to have a big effect. In the case of Senegal, I would actually suggest that this was very much um, a critical sector for a few reasons. I didn't get into it, but rice is the most important food crop, so it's critical for food security for the program. So, in fact, rather than getting everyone, let's say, you know, when Senegal looked at the balance of payments challenge that they had and the outflows from the large scale importation of rice, which they also saw as being a critical national food security crop for the country, they actually saw this as being one of the key sectors that they needed to enhance and bolster domestic production of. So um, they and the government, or I mean, the president himself got very involved in that, directing a lot of effort to be putting into it, and that actually reflected in the subsidy that ultimately was introduced for this mechanism to make sure that widespread adoption happened. Now, I don't think the subsidy was actually needed, but and it might have even complicated things for market actors instead of helping them. But yeah, there was, I think in that case, a pretty substantial shift. And just from an economic development perspective, Senegal is one of the few countries that had a substantial drop in their imports of rice. So actually, they've been able to maintain a larger share of that spending, domestically, as well as be a little bit less exposed to the challenges that might exist from relying on your key crop to be largely imported. So let's stop maybe at this point and let's go into the kind of reflections on the exercise. Maybe if you want to share some of your thoughts in the chat, if you haven't had a chance to do so, just in filling it out. Um, I can put back up some of the questions to reflect on in your example, or I mean, in your experience. Um, I realize that I kind of have thrown either one or two brand new frameworks at you, probably with not that much explanation. So I admire your willingness to jump in and try applying a new one and really thinking about how it might be something that you that spurs your thinking in a new way. Sadrich, yes, certainly. You can apply both frameworks to a particular intervention. Actually, for me, that's one of the things that I like is not being like devoted to a single framework. Because I think one of the things, and one of my arguments why I like frameworks in general around systems change is that they'll perhaps prompt you to think about and even observe some changes you might have otherwise not been looking for. And Zakaria, that systems change must address the root causes of the poor performance. Totally agree. I think that comes a lot back to the system change vision, which really needs to be informed by your understanding, however imperfect, of how a system operates, why it's working that, uh, yeah, why it works that way. Let's see what else we've got here. Do, do, do. Um, Dan. Yep. Yeah. So Dan spotted, that the networks really were a place to look at the kind of commercial relationships fitting in here. Um, Livingston found it to be a struggle to figure out where to maybe put things in that, and AER being very straightforward. Totally agree. I think that is one of the beautiful things about AER is it's kind of there, and it's got that very intervention focused lens. So it's kind of like, where do I start, and what do I expect to happen next, right? So I think that's really interesting. John likes the kind of DSD, which you're very right, John, is inspired by the kind of iceberg framework, of systems change, really like looking deeper. As for those of you who aren't familiar with the reference, is kind of the whole idea of depth or stickier changes is that a lot of times in systems, you spot a lot of things right up at the top, and those are sometimes all you see, but a lot of the deeper changes in how a system is operating are a little bit below the surface, and can be things that you might miss if you're not actively aware of or looking for them. And so I think that's one of the element things.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Then you could just, I
Oh
think,
yes, of course. Yeah. I'll move forward to show some of the things. So just to, this was a rapid take, but just to show you two different ways of visualizing it using those frameworks. So here was the completed kind of case of Senegal, um, presenting kind of at a big picture the kind of changes. There was lots of other exam diagrams that looked more like focus function by focus function. But here you can see kind of where some of the things that were provided in this example were placed in terms of being disruptions, some of the kind of adoption, the replication of this in new places, the institutionalization by the government and its agencies. So all of those being those kind of disruptions, those single agent changes that you want to see, but that you're ultimately hoping are going to be you're going to see those deeper signs of change. So, and to the point about what's the degree of change, that's where the kind of the pluses, the minuses kind of tell you, are these stable changes, or did we really see bigger or smaller changes in these things over time. Then, in the network side and in the norm side, you can also see some of these changes in mental models around, that collateralizing, agricultural crops does work, the kind of consumer level shifts, but also recognizing, hey, this wasn't the only entity involved. There were others doing things as well, and those help contribute to these changes as well. So that's one, framework, and I'm going to show you later a document that has a number of different ways to visualize systems changes, which I think is very nice and came out recently. But here would be one way with the DSD framework to kind of show or visualize some of these changes that were spotted. Then AAER, I'd be curious if others have a different kind of perspective on where I put these. But you can see kind of a thing in which you have kind of the LBA, initially adopting and offering it, and it being kind of increasingly therefore taken up by the processors and the rice farmers. Their adaptation includes the expansion to other areas of the country. The fact that market actors, even ones not involved in the program, were kind of taking on these contracts and beginning to accept contractualization. And then some of the respond areas around the institutionalization by the government, the kind of mental model, norm changes, that sort of thing. So kind of the takeaway here, I think, is that different frameworks prompt us to think about things in slightly different ways, right? So as we're thinking about frameworks and which ones we want to use, here are a few of the things you might want to reflect on. First is your audience and what their preferences are. Maybe they have a framework that they prefer or that they're used to and that they like using. That might be something you want to think about. Another one is the types of changes that you want to look for and how much you want to be open to unexpected and negative changes. That's really important in thinking about it. The social network analysis focused frameworks, well, those are really important at understanding network changes. So if that's your real focus, great ones to use. However, they're not going to get you those other types of changes, right? If you're looking at a framework that starts with the intervention and it's like that's the model is like this diffusion of innovations sort of approach of something gets introduced and it snowballs, then you need to be careful that you're not overlooking kind of negative and other unexpected changes that might occur. Another reflection in thinking about your framework is where the boundaries are going to be, right? So AAR is very much a bottom-up framework. It's like you start with the intervention and then you look from there at what happens, right? And when you take that approach, you're going to spot things linking back primarily to your interventions because that's what your starting point is, right? So if that's the critical thing, that you're wanting to understand is like, how did X intervention do it? Then a framework like AAR is fantastic for the purpose, right? If you, though, are also wanting to check, well, what else has happened here? Then you want to be careful about frameworks that start so explicitly with the intervention, because you're probably more likely to miss some of the broader changes within the system if you're not concentrating on fully understanding how particular functions have evolved. And sometimes there's some really interesting examples of some big systemic changes that have been spotted basically by not approaching the system in the same way that the MEL system already does. You're much more likely, I think, to spot what the MEL system has already understood if you use the same analytical approach as the MEL system. So that's perhaps one argument for using, other frameworks to help test your thinking. And then visualization. What do you want to show? Like, who's your audience and how do you want to show the changes that are happening? I think is one final thing to think about as you're selecting a framework. And as someone said in the comments, you don't have to just pick one. I mean, you might want to pick only one to visualize what you've found. But in terms of the design and the thinking process, it might make a lot of sense to to look at a couple. So Munib, maybe I'll turn it over to you to if there's any kind of interesting questions or comments before we do a wrap up.
I think we've had like a lot of engagement in the chat and people have been like engaging with each other, so that has been quite
Hmm,
good. Um,
perfect.
I think a question on boundaries is somewhat consistent. I think because a lot of it comes to planning, right? So defining the
Hmm,
vision for change, how do you set boundaries? I think
yeah,
Christian had a good point here in which he said like even with boundaries, five actors that are adopting might be a big thing for one context as compared to 100 in another context. So how do you set that vision? How, are you too ambitious or too conservative? What are the some of the factors that you would think about when defining a boundary for change, right? So I
hmm,
would assume like the timeline, the time frame, the budgets, and these things also factor in here. So maybe a bit on
totally.
that. I think that's a recurring theme here in the questions.
Right. So the boundaries, so important. And so often just something we assume, which is why it almost feels weird to give it a lot of attention because it's like obviously I'm working in the like livestock system in Eastern X country or something like that, right? Like what other boundary could there possibly be? Um, so yes, agree. Boundaries in terms of your study might need to be more narrow based on your resources for sure. Um, but also thinking about whether that same like defining your examination in the very same way that your program has looked at it is ideal or not. It may be because you're going to capture the full set of things that your program is interested in, and potentially the things that have been influenced. But the con is one, you may end up finding all the same things you already looked at because you don't have a fresh perspective on it. Um, and some of the times that we've seen that there's been a lot of effectiveness is actually by switching the framework that you're looking at, like examining a different set of results by looking at it, say, on a geographic level instead of on a sector level. I've seen that be really interesting, and some of the unexpected changes that have happened that no one was aware of because no one was talking to anyone who wasn't involved in the livestock sector. So it's like, therefore, all the changes like the ripple effects and the indirect results happening in the broader economy, nobody knew about because it just was never a part of a survey or a sample that was being put forward. So I think that's something to really carefully examine.
And I think that just comes down to the intentionality of it, right? Because I feel like most often program teams are so busy with their day-to-day intervention focused measurement, they
Mm,
sometimes they lose track of the bigger picture. So is systemic change
mm,
something that should be intentionally built in consciously in your measurement frameworks from the start of the program? Is it something that you start to identify changes happening and then you put it on the agenda? Because sometimes the question really becomes, is systemic change something that the donor wants you to see or achieve? Is that a target in itself? Um,
mm.
how do you approach that? Like, where do you think like programs should position themselves?
I think for programs that have a system vision, it is worth building in early because uh, when we think about it from the improve lens, understanding whether at least there's early signs of change in those systems in the way you'd like to see really helps you to check whether you're on the right track. Even if they're however imperfect, however like contribution and all that, you have to really throw aside. Um, but if you don't start looking at it until much later, the risk is that you may have had a lot of those like disruption or early signs of change, but not actually address some of those broader changes. And I think the risk as well is if you look at everything only at the like intervention by intervention lens, and you're not stepping back to understand the broader set of changes, you could easily find yourself making very incremental minor changes and not actually having a bigger impact. So I would strongly recommend to build that in from early on in the process. Um, and then complement it, use a few different methods. Maybe an intentional approach where you're thinking about it, but you're also using approaches that are going to allow you to spot less expected changes.
Right. Excellent. I know we're out of time, and I think Ben and I, when we were planning this webinar, had a long discussion about this, about how far we'll be able to come through. Uh, I think if you, yeah, that's a good one. If you just leave it to some relevant material that I think would be quite useful for people to take away from this. I can share these as well with an email. Ben, there have has been like a lot of requests for the
Mhm.
content of the
Mhm.
webinar that you've shared, so maybe we could also
Yeah,
share that. The recording will be coming through. Um,
perfect.
and as part of the DCED series, there is another webinar coming in about 3 weeks from now, which is on results chain. So stay tuned for that. I'll drop a link here in case you have not registered for it yet. On this, I know it's going to be an endless session, Ben. I think there are like so many questions. Maybe I would like
Mhm.
request you to have another follow-up session
Mhm.
after this because it's quite popular. But we'll reach out, we'll send relevant material. I think if you have any other frameworks like we talked about or any other
Mm,
material, Sigrid has shared one with me already. We would
perfect.
love to share it with everyone else. Um, and we will continue speaking in this space. So we will also request for other topics that you're interested to see. So in my email that you would receive later, I will request if there, what are other topics that you are interested to hear more about. So we will be happy to facilitate that for you. Ben's email is right there. I'll share that as well in the email. So if you've got any questions, suggestions, or feedback that you want from Ben, it would be really helpful.
And maybe just also a shout out because I noticed that she's here with us today, but a note of appreciation to Kristen O'Planick, who was really the brainchild behind getting the funding, which we know is never easy, to conduct the Senegal study that we used today as our example, because that was quite the task that she took on and did so with a lot of success.
Excellent. Absolutely. Absolutely. With this, I'll just bring this to a close. Thank you so much for being engaged throughout. Really appreciate you all attending. With that, have a nice rest of the week. Thanks.